Hi, everybody. How are you? Glad to see you here. Hey, Dolores. Hey, Evelina. Hey, Dolores, you're both on Facebook and YouTube. Hi, Dia. Hello, Kay. Question that Dia asks. Looks like Democrats are already caving about impeachment. They willing to just censure. Going to make a little adjustment to my face here, if you'll bear with me a bit. I think I had a bit too much red in it, so I think that looks a little bit better, doesn't it? So are they being smart here or just weak again? Well, I think they should run a full-scale trial. If the Republicans vote to let Trump off, let that be on them. I don't think that's going to be enough for Trump. I think he's probably going to go ahead, whatever they do, and start a new party. I think the Republicans are being stupid in not voting for his conviction and allowing Democrats, or them both actually, both major parties, to bar him from serving in public office again. That should be what they both want to do, because it gets rid of him from that point of view. Now, he'll still start his own party, probably run his daughter or his son-in-law, but of course they won't be as effective, at whipping up the Trumpists. So I think that's what the major parties ought to do. I don't think they ought to let him get away with this without impeaching him and subjecting him to the penalties provided by the Constitution. I think it's important, to demonstrate that, because what they and the Republicans are now doing is they're demonstrating that the penalties in the Constitution are not sufficient for a president, because things are too partisan in the country. They're demonstrating that the methods, the tools put in place by the founding fathers, but for a president who literally subjected the House to an insurrection, that those penalties are not sufficient. They can't be enforced. There's nobody who's objective enough to enforce them. That is, the 2/3 of majority is too much to get. In the situation they're in now, it would have been tough, actually, for the Democrats to get the 51 votes. If 51 votes were all that were actually required, because they'd still have to face the filibuster, right? So there it is. Anyway, Steve Gonzo gives us something from Threadreader app. Something about the aggregate IQ which worked for the Trump campaign in 2016. Sandy says, hello. Hello, Sandy. You think I look good? Thank you, Sandy. Lana Dell says, hi, folks. Ilana. Diaz says, yes, I said that too. Let Republicans hang themselves. Republicans are leaving the party in record numbers. That's good or bad, I'm not sure. If they're leaving because they still love Donald, I think some of them are leaving because they still love the Donald. Others are leaving because they're going to go over to the Democrats. Terry Cook says, when I posted in 2016, the Green New Deal was a farce without homemade green hydrogen, hemp, and the self-sufficient industries and economies. I received an A+ from the cool people of Facebook by bringing on the second example of a giant logo after that message on somebody's Write Something box, where there was never one before. John Nicholson's Citizens Committee for Restructured Government synopsis addressed to me political plan, the Top Cat plan, is the only total green plan which became T. And it stops there. So I cannot read the rest of it even if I wanted to. So I will go now to the business of the evening and talk about some of the climate news. So I'll share the screen for that. And we will move to something Chuck Schumer said. He said, incredible. Schumer says Biden should declare a climate emergency. This is from Common Dreams, January 26th. And from Andrea Germanis, a staff writer for them. And there's Chuck Schumer. Giving somebody the warning finger. And the article says, advocates for bold climate action welcomed Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer's remarks late Monday, calling for President Joe Biden to declare a climate emergency. That's huge, tweeted Dallas Goldtooth, the Keep It in the Ground campaign organizer for the Indigenous Environmental Network. It would allow the president to take significant steps to confront climate chaos. The New York Democrats' comment came Monday evening in an interview with MSNBC's Rachel Maddow. Quote, I think it might be a good idea for President Biden to call a climate emergency, said Schumer. Then he can do many, many things under the emergency powers of the president that he could do without legislation, unquote. Now, Trump used this emergency for a stupid wall, which wasn't an emergency. But if ever there was an emergency, climate is one, unquote, Schumer said. Haven't heard Schumer say too many things like that. That's good that he did that. Schumer reiterated the suggestion in a Monday night tweet, stating unequivocally that Biden should declare a national emergency on the climate crisis. And Michael Mann replied, interesting comments by Senator Schumer on Rachel Maddow's show tonight. Democrats should pass climate by legislation, but through reconciliation, simple majority, and B, Joe Biden should declare climate an emergency, quote unquote, which grants him greater latitude in executive actions on climate. Water protector Joy Braun, a member of the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe, joined the chorus of cheers, tweeting, "Holy macaroni!" Holy macaroni, haven't heard that one in a long time. Schumer says, declare climate emergency. Okay, who said damn prayers, unquote. Author and 350.org co-founder Bill McKibben suggested the Biden's demand was evidence of the climate movement's impact. And Bill said, quote, when we shift the zeitgeist, we shift what's politically possible and what's politically necessary. Keep it up, everybody. That take was mirrored by youth climate leader and Earth Uprising International founder Alexandria Villaseñor, who said the remark was a sign Schumer was, quote, keeping the promise he made to me and our generation, unquote. Boy, that's a lot better reception that by young people got from Dianne Feinstein, isn't it? The comment is, quote, incredible, unquote, and a sign of a tectonic shift, said Sunrise Movement co-founder and political director Evan Weber, who, like environmental policy expert Dr. Leah Stokes, welcomed Schumer, saying that his legislative policy priorities are climate, the racial and economic inequality and democracy reform. Well, let's hope so. But it'll take more than words. It's going to take some action, too. So a coalition of climate groups, he didn't say that, I said that. Or she didn't say that, I said that. Okay. A collection of climate groups, including the Center for Biological Diversity, has, it was Evan Weber who said that. So, okay. So a coalition of climate groups, including the Center for Biological Diversity, has already drafted an executive order for Biden to be a, quote, climate president, unquote, with action including the declaration of a climate emergency. And Gene Sue tweeted, thank you, Senator Schumer. 400 groups are with you, calling on @POTUS to sign an executive order to confront the hashtag climate emergency with the full power of the executive branch, hashtag climate president, hashtag build back fossil free, biologicaldiversity.org/w/news press release. Joe Biden must be the climate president. We're out of time. Declare a climate emergency. That's from the website climatepresident.org. Gene Sue also tweeted under a hashtag climate emergency declaration @POTUS as hashtag climate president could reinstate the crude oil exports ban for good by redirect funding to build out clean, distributed, and democratic energy systems, use the Defense Production Act to ignite a full-scale clean energy economy. Recent polling indicates a majority of the U.S. public would back that action. And a Yale program on climate change communication survey from December found that 56% of voters would support a president, quote, declaring a national emergency to act on global warming, unquote, with 84% of Democratic voters backing such an action. That support is also clear from Green New Deal champion Senator Ed Markey, Democrat of Massachusetts, who tweeted Tuesday, quote, we've got to recognize the climate crisis for what it is, an existential threat to life on Earth, unquote. Quote, I'm glad Senator Schumer agrees we must meet this emergency with a bold vision, transform our economy, and fight for justice in every step we take, said Markey. Not all Democratic lawmakers are on board. Sunrise's Weber, in his tweet, pointed to the need for Schumer to have a plan to not only, quote, bypass GOP obstruction, unquote, in advancing climate and other priorities, but also tackle pushback from Democratic senators like Joe Manchin of West Virginia and Kirsten Sinema of Arizona, whose opposition to eliminating the legislative the filibuster enraged progressive Democrats. As Senate Majority Leader, he'll be judged by his results, not just his positions, unquote. But Weber added. So Weber, making it clear, results count, not just positions. The young are about results. And not only that, oldsters like me and Ed Markey are about results too. And here's a piece. Here's a piece on executive orders and their significance by Dave Dayen. Let me share that one for you too. And Dave says, Biden's executive actions just scratch the surface. Implementing congressional laws is massively important to make progress, and Biden has the ability to go further. And Dave says, today President Biden continues with the latest in a series of executive actions that have been pushed out nonstop since the first day of his presidency. The latest ones are focused on climate, and there are a couple big headlines. Biden will suspend new oil and gas leasing on federal land, building on a 60-day moratorium issued by the Department of the Interior on his first day in office. And he will require federal agencies to procure clean energy and zero-emission vehicles to green the federal government. That clean and green tech must be produced in America with prevailing wage labor. Very important, of course. There are a bunch more actions. An international climate summit on Earth Day, for example, and the establishment of a civilian climate corps. That's a second CCC, a civilian climate corps. The first CCC was the Civilian Conservation Corps, was part of the New Deal, okay, by FDR. But those are the big ones. These combine with a suite of initiatives that have been rolled out over the past week as a palate cleanser to get the taste of the Trump era out of our collective mouths. It's a great start. It gives the impression of decisive action. The PR value of devoting each day to a particular crisis has paid off. And what Biden is doing, even if it extends only to reversing Trump-era rules and actions, will help a lot of people. We shouldn't forget that. That said, I do follow this stuff fairly closely. We're in the midst of rolling out an update to the Day One agenda that I think you're all going to like, and I'm not going to ruin it here. But I can just say that in a lot of ways on these executive actions, the style is doing a fair bit more than the substance, says Dave, who's addicted, of course, to telling the truth as he sees it. He doesn't pull any punches. So let's start with that oil and gas, the leasing issue. Of course, it applies to new leases, not existing ones. Oil and gas companies stockpiled leases on federal land at the end of the Trump administration. The Biden order only applies to new leases, not new drilling and mining. And even this is a temporary moratorium. You could see leasing return pending a federal review. Just as a practical matter, federal lands are the site of only about 9% of U.S. onshore drilling. Quote, this will not significantly impact the direction of the energy industry in the short term, unquote, said the head of one climate nonprofit, the HuffPost. There would certainly be ways to get at domestic production in total to reduce carbon burning, sanctioning companies responsible for methane. And other pollution that leaks into the atmosphere through old wells would raise the cost of drilling, for example. Chuck Schumer has asked Biden to declare a climate emergency, which would enable him to direct resources to clean energy investment. Instead, we got as a first step some procurement and a temporary moratorium on a tiny sliver of permitting. It's just the beginning of scaling a high mountain. Other executive orders are similarly less than meets the eye. But yesterday, Biden ordered the Justice Department to allow existing federal contracts with the private prison industry to expire and not to be renewed by attrition. This will get private prisons out of the business of operating federal prisons. Quote, this is a huge win, unquote, said by Representative Ilhan Omar, Democrat of Minnesota. But federal private prisons are not a major part of the industry's business model. Indeed, prisons aren't really the main function of the private prison industry anymore. Private prisons cover only about 8% of the prison population at the federal, state, and local level. Ending Justice Department contracts certainly sends a signal, but private prisons just don't have that much of a footprint in domestic incarceration. They have an enormous footprint in immigration detention, with something like 72% of migrants under ICE's control sleep in privatized detention beds, mostly managed by the two private prison companies, Core Civic and GEO Group. Yet the Biden order, like the Obama order from 2016 that it restores, only ends contracts between the Justice Department and the private prison industry, not the Department of Homeland Security and that industry. The latter would make an actual difference to the private prison business model and make it extremely hard to detain immigrants in the near term. That road was not taken. It goes on from there. Biden's action on fair housing was weirdly nonspecific. He could have restored the Obama era, quote, affirmatively furthering fair housing, unquote, rule that the Trump Department of Housing and Urban Development repealed. But instead it directs HUD to, quote, examine, unquote, the effects of that repeal and, quote, take any necessary steps, unquote, to prevent housing discrimination. There was supposed to be policing actions in yesterday's orders, which focused on racial equity, but didn't make the final list, despite suggestions to advocacy groups that they would be included. Now, just because I'm looking skeptically at some of Biden's executive actions, should not discount the importance of executive actions generally. This was a really dumb piece from the New York Times intimating that executive actions are just a slideshow to the real work of governing that can be overturned on a whim and have no real effect. Just because Trump based his presidency on fragile executive orders that could be reversed quickly doesn't taint all potential executive actions that can really help people. Congress passes the law and presidents implement them. That's literally the job description of the president in Article 2 of the Constitution. Biden, for example, increased eligibility for nutrition assistance. in a way that's going to help a poor family getting another $100 a week in food. Trump used the 1930s era Commodity Credit Corporation to compensate for his trade war and help farmers get through a tough stretch with billions in support. You can't, quote, roll that back, unquote, since the money is out the door. You can't, quote, roll back, unquote, a $15 an hour minimum wage for federal contractors, as Biden is moving toward. They'll just earn more. Now, the next president could change that, but only after 4 years of higher wages, which won't be a popular move. And workers will have already banked the cash based on the executive order by Biden. My point is this: implementing laws already passed by Congress with latent authorities that have real power and importance is critical. This is the primary role of a president, not to devise a legislative agenda. And we should scrutinize these actions closely, not with the gloss that they're just executive orders, quote unquote, that will be overturned in the future. The cult of the presidency is debilitating, and part of it stems from viewing presidents as legislators. They are implementers, and they should implement to the maximum potential allowed by law. So that is a cautionary column by Dave, making quite clear the constitutional role of the president and how that is different from the constitutional role of the Congress. If we want big changes, it's up to the Congress to pass things, as we'll see later when we get into fiscal policy, and as we'll see now when we get into the issues of the filibuster. So, here is a piece from the Sunrise Movement. Let me share that for you. Oh, please share this as much as you can. It's not actually a piece from the Sunrise Movement, from Common Dreams, but it's about the Sunrise Movement, and it's by Jake Johnson, and it was done today. The headline is, "Now is the moment to deliver," unquote. Sunrise Movement says Biden climate ambitions require abolition of the Senate filibuster. So the Sunrise Movement knows what the connection is between what the movement has to do and the continued existence of the filibuster. And the cautionary statement coming out of Sunrise was, quote, "Our generation accept any excuses for delay or inaction when it comes to delivering historic legislation to build back better," unquote. And there is a photo of a lady holding a sign saying, "Prioritize people and planet," with a lovely tree in the background. This is from a climate march in Manhattan on September 20th, 2020. So the Sunrise Movement was applauding Joe Biden's newly announced executive actions as, quote, "historic step forward in the fight against the climate crisis." But by the way, I should point out that Biden also made a statement only today that he wasn't ending fracking, that fracking was going to go on. So before we get really high on the historic steps forward in the fight against the climate crisis, note that he's still trying to tread that very narrow center line. No, I'm not going to get rid of fracking. Anyway, in the fight against the climate crisis, the youth-led Sunrise Movement on Wednesday said, a Democratic Party, sorry, must use its unified control of the federal government to go further with bold legislation that invests massively in clean energy, creates millions of good paying jobs, and ensures a speedy and just transition away from planet destroying fossil fuels. And such sweeping legislation will only be possible, Sunrise argued, if Democrats swiftly move to eliminate the legislative filibuster. Of course. Quote, today makes clear that President Biden hears our generation's demands loud and clear, understands the power of our movement, and is serious about using executive power to deliver on his campaign promises. Sunrise Executive Director Varshini Prakash said in a statement celebrating the wave of climate-related executive orders Biden is expected to sign on Wednesday afternoon. According to a fact sheet released by the White House Wednesday morning, the batch of orders will, among other things, include a pause on all new oil and natural gas leases on public lands and offshore waters, official establishment of the Office of Domestic Climate Policy and National Climate Task Force. They did do that, and a directive mandating that federal agencies eliminate fossil fuel subsidies and identify new opportunities to spur innovation, commercialization, and the deployment of clean energy technologies, unquote. While green groups nationwide applauded the measures in what they broadly signal, Mitch Jones, policy director at Food and Water Watch, said in a statement that Biden's orders fall well short of what's needed and, quote, must be paired with serious plans to stop our deadly addiction to fossil fuels. Quote, we need a White House that is committed to stopping all drilling and fracking and shutting down any schemes to export fossil fuels, unquote, said Jones. And Varshini Prakash also stressed the need for further action, declaring that, quote, today must just be the beginning, unquote, of the administration's efforts. Our generation, quote unquote, she warned, and quote again, will not accept any excuses for delay or inaction on delivering historic legislation to build back better, creating millions of good jobs, investing in clean energy communities and sustainable infrastructure, unquote. We have no time to waste. The climate crisis compounded, should have said, quote again, the climate crisis compounded by the pandemic, racial injustice, decades of Republican obstruction and destructive policies demands that we make up for lost time to match the scale and urgency of this moment. The Democrats have a majority in the House, Senate, and a president ready to take action. Now is the moment, to deliver transformative change for the American people. Specifically, Prakash implored Senate Democrats to move quickly to eliminate the legislative filibuster, an archaic 60-vote rule that effectively gives the Republican minority veto power over much of Biden's climate agenda. Though significant climate-related spending, such as the investments in green infrastructure that Biden and Democratic lawmakers have promised, can be approved through the filibuster-proof budget reconciliation process. The rules governing that procedural tool would prevent passage of key regulatory changes, such as a binding clean energy requirement and other priorities. Vox's David Roberts wrote last year that, quote, to fully pass a complete climate policy, the kind appropriate to the challenge, Democrats would have to stretch the reconciliation process well beyond its traditional bounds, unquote. Quote, even if they were willing to do that, it's not going to result in particularly good policy, unquote, said Roberts. And quote again, the filibuster needs to go. In a modern society, the majority needs to be able to legislate, unquote. And Prakash echoed that argument on Wednesday, urging Biden and Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, Democrat of New York, to, quote, push to abolish the Senate filibuster to ensure the will of the people and deliver needed economic relief and transformation. And the Sunrise Movement tweeted, Biden's executive orders are a huge victory for our movement and our future. But the pressure can't stop now. This is the floor, not the ceiling. And we are going to fight for every inch of progress. Join our fight Thursday, January 28th at 8 to 9 p.m. ET. And she gives the link to that in this article. So you can take a look at the article. There, okay, is Varshini Prakash and a little video of her, which I won't play. Biden and Schumer have both voiced openness to eliminating the filibuster. But to do so, they would have to win over recalcitrant defenders of the filibuster, such as Senators Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema, who both reiterated their commitment to keeping the filibuster intact earlier this week. And not only that, they made very strong statements of commitment that seem to have been directed at Mitch McConnell, as if they owed Mitch McConnell anything or should be talking to Mitch McConnell at all, who promptly interpreted those statements as sacred promises to him that they weren't going to vote to get rid of the filibuster. Anyway, writing for the Arizona Mirror earlier this week, Sunrise Movement Tempe member Emily Kirkland warned that, quote, as long as the filibuster remains in place, the Democrats are stuck. Not just Democrats, folks. We, the people, are stuck. Our survival is threatened by the filibuster and by the Republicans. Now, not saying it's not threatened by 10 Democrats who seem to take the crisis less than fully seriously. But the point is, if we're going to grapple with the 10 Democrats, we have to get through the 50 Republicans first. And we can do that by ending the filibuster. So this morning on Rising, I heard Crystal Ball say something like, well, right now the filibuster isn't really so much the problem. The problem is the commitment on the Democratic side, whether they're willing to go against their donors or not. That's fine. That's fine. That's certainly a problem. That's certainly a very serious problem. But the immediate problem is getting the hell rid of the filibuster. So that's not a problem anymore when they do finally get the will to do something about it. We can hardly bash on them to have the will to do something unless we bash on them to get rid of the filibuster first. First things first, folks. Get rid of the filibuster. Quote, we are facing a moment of peril, almost unparalleled in modern history. Hundreds of thousands have died from COVID-19. Unemployment is at record levels. And urgent action is needed on racial justice, immigration, climate change, inequality, and other long-simmering crises, unquote, Kirkland wrote. Quote, with a trifecta in Washington, D.C., Democrats have the opportunity to pass popular common sense policies to meet this moment and improve the lives of millions, unquote. But if I can interject here, Democrats don't have the opportunity to pass such policies unless they can bring Kyrsten Sinema, Joe Manchin, John Tester, Dianne Feinstein, also Mark Warner, and other members of the Democrats' gang of 8 into line with the majority of the caucus. If they don't have the will to exert party discipline and do that and get rid of the filibuster, they're not going to have the opportunity. They have the opportunity only if they get rid of the filibuster. And Kirkland added, quote, they should abolish the filibuster and get to work. Yes, absolutely. Without that, they go nowhere. So, here's another one from Common Dreams. And the headline on this one is, quote, you stole a Supreme Court seat, unquote. Critics pan McConnell threat to sabotage the Senate if Democrats target the filibuster. And this is by Jake Johnson. And it was today. There's a picture of Mitch from January 26, 2021, heading to the Senate floor before being called into session. He threatened Tuesday to grind the workings of the notoriously sluggish upper chamber to a complete halt if the Democratic majority attempts to scrap the legislative filibuster. This warning was met with immediate derision, given the Kentucky Republicans' elimination of the 60-vote rule for Supreme Court nominees less than 4 years ago. Well, there may have been this derision, but when Mitch moved to do this less than 4 years ago, did the Democrats grind the workings of the notoriously sluggish upper chamber to a complete halt when the Republicans did this? No, the Democrats just caved. I got to remind you, they just caved. They could have ground it to a halt. They just caved. They could have ground it to a halt when Mitch tried to get Amy Coney Barrett through. They could have stopped the confirmation of Amy Coney Barrett and insisted that the Republicans address a stimulus bill first. Did they do that? No, they caved. Anyway, in a speech on the Senate floor just hours after he dropped his demand that Democrats commit to leaving the legislative filibuster intact as part of a must-pass organizing resolution, Senator McConnell cautioned that, quote, destroying the filibuster would drain comity and consent from this body to a degree that would be unparalleled in living memory, unquote. Well, that may be, but guess what? If you get rid of the filibuster, it's much, much harder to grind the notoriously sluggish upper chamber to a complete halt. Why is that true? Because if you try to use the rules to grind the upper chamber to a complete halt, all the Democrats would have to do is to move to repeal a particular rule being used by the Republicans to grind things to a complete halt, and the Republicans would no longer be able to filibuster that. So it would just be a straight up vote. And the Democrats would have 51 votes, and they'd be able to stop the Republicans using Senate rules to grind things to a complete halt. That's why. So maybe the Democrats reaction of derision was perfectly well justified. But of course, it would be necessary for the Democrats to have the will to ride roughshod over the Republicans. That's the kind of will we have never seen from the Democrats in living memory. We haven't seen that kind of will from the Democrats since the Johnson administration. Well, maybe we saw similar resolve in parts of the 1970s. We certainly haven't seen it since the 1980s, even when they still controlled the Senate in the 1980s. In a speech on the Senate floor, just hours after he dropped his demand that the Democrats commit to leaving the filibuster intact, he cautioned, I guess I read that. That's the second time that was stated. Anyway, going on. Taking that plunge would not be some progressive dream. It would be a nightmare. I guarantee it, added McConnell, who said Republicans could obstruct Senate business by denying a quorum, the number of senators required to be present for the chamber to operate. As Daily Kos political director David Neer pointed out, quote, if Republican senators refuse to show up for a quorum call, Democrats can direct the Senate's sergeant-at-arms to direct them and compel their attendance. That's how radical a threat withholding quorum is. You can be arrested for doing so, unquote, David Neer noted. I don't really think they're going to be able to do that, because I think it'll be possible for the Democrats to find the votes they need for a quorum. I don't think that's very hard in the Senate. I haven't looked up how many senators are necessary for a quorum call, but if it's like the House, there are 51 senators needed to attend, a quorum in order for the Senate to operate. So I don't think Mitch is going to be able to deny a quorum anytime soon, because the sergeant-at-arms is certainly going to be able to round up at least one Republican senator from somewhere, and possibly many more than one Republican senator, and drag them kicking and screaming into the chamber so that they can have a quorum. The minority leader echoed the message of his floor speech in a tweet Tuesday evening, declaring that nuking the filibuster would drain the consent and comity out of the institution and leave the Senate unable to function. So let me get this straight. Here's the filibuster, which to most of the public is an obscure rule that they don't care about it. And to the extent they do care about it, they're against it. So what Mitch is going to do is he is going to get angry because the Democrats are getting rid of the filibuster that's blocking all the legislation the public wants, and then Mitch is going to shut down the Senate so it can't operate to pass the legislation the public wants, because he and the Republicans are angry that the Democrats took away their power to pass all the legislation that the public wants. Now, which party is going to lose out from that conflict? Is the public going to blame the Democrats for getting rid of the filibuster, or the Republicans for shutting down the Senate? That is a really, really ridiculous threat. Democratic lawmakers and commentators responded by pointing to McConnell's refusal to allow a vote on former President Obama's Supreme Court nominee and subsequent elimination of the judicial filibuster to confirm right-wing Justice Neil Gorsuch in April of 2017 and clear the way for later confirmation of 2 additional Trump High Court nominees. You lost all credibility when you stole a Supreme Court seat, tweeted Representative Omar. The filibuster is a Jim Crow relic. It represents everything wrong with Washington. Abolish it. By the way, the Minnesota Democrat added, quote, Senate Democrats represent 41.5 million more Americans than Mitch and his caucus. Blocking needed relief for Americans has nothing to do with consent and comedy, and everything to do with destroying democracy, unquote. Truer words were never spoken. Ari Berman of Mother Jones said, it is, quote, truly maddening to hear Mitch McConnell warn of nightmare, quote unquote, if Dems abolish filibuster when he already killed it to put 3 Trump justices on the Supreme Court and confirmed Amy Coney Barrett 8 days before an election. And he tweeted, no one has benefited more from a minority rule and done more to ensure it than Mitch McConnell, unquote. When history books are written, he will be judged to have done as much damage to American democracy, if not more, than Donald Trump. Probably. And he continues to do that damage, even today, because he's leading the Republicans to acquit Donald Trump, so Donald Trump will be free to run again for the presidency in 2024. He's doing more damage even today. So McConnell's threat to gum up the works of the Senate, even more than he already has, came as the chamber's new Democratic majority began taking steps to advance Joe Biden's proposed coronavirus relief package through the special reconciliation process, a move made necessary by vocal Republican opposition to the new aid measure. The Washington Post reported late Tuesday that Democratic leaders in both chambers are tentatively planning to introduce a budget resolution on Monday that could come to a vote later in the week. Hopefully, that's good. What's Monday? Monday is February 1st. It better come to a vote that week because the trial starts the week of February 8th. They're going to have to work over the weekend that week to get that resolution through. Quote, the resolution would instruct committees to write legislation codifying Biden's $1.9 trillion pandemic relief plan, the Post said, the Washington Post. And quote again, on the special rules governing the resolution. The resolution could pass the Senate with a simple majority vote, and the subsequent COVID-19 relief bill could also pass with a simple majority, even without eliminating the filibuster. It could, but let's hope that legislation is already written, that they haven't been just sitting around in the House and the Senate. If I know Bernie, he's been writing it. The question is, have Pelosi and her team been writing the legislation to codify Biden's plan? Let us hope they've been busy doing that, because it's going to be a complex bill. There's going to be a lot of pages, and there's not much time left between now and Monday, which, as I said, if I counted right, will be February 1st. While a coronavirus relief package could clear the Senate with the filibuster intact, former Senate staffer Adam Jentelson said in an interview with the Inc. Tuesday that Democrats, quote, will never be able to use reconciliation to pass things like civil rights, democracy reform, such as H.R. 1, by the way, which they're very keen to pass, statehood, gun control, or many climate change resolutions due to rules restricting the kind of legislation that can be passed through the expedited budget process, meaning the urgency of abolishing the archaic 60-vote rule remains. Quote, pulling our punches now will mean we fail to reform our democracy and get climate change under control for starters. Then when McConnell is back in power, he will chuckle and nuke the filibuster himself the first time it serves his interests. Yes, of course. In a series of tweets Tuesday, Gentleson argued that the minority leader's threat to defend the filibuster by plunging the Senate into chaos, quote, is the worst he can come up with, and it's vastly preferable to letting McConnell block Joe Biden's agenda, unquote. Quote, unintentionally, Senator McConnell is revealing how his power relies heavily on the filibuster, unquote. All that is right. But no one has made the argument, as I just did, that if Mitch responds to getting rid of the filibuster by trying to close down the Senate, that is going to be the thing that absolutely guarantees that there will be a landslide for the Democrats in voting for the Senate in 2022. Right there, if Mitch goes through with that threat, he will have lost the campaign of 2022. First, if Trump starts his party, there are going to be an awful lot of victories, or there are going to be an awful lot of people who will be nominated by Trump's party that will be running to McConnell's right. So where is McConnell going to run to? Where will the guy who shut down the Senate and prevented, if he's successful, popular legislation from getting through, where is he going to run to? He's going to be the person who made it impossible to pass the popular legislation. He's going to be the person who made it impossible for Democrats to deliver, who gave Joe Biden the perfect excuse to not actually deliver on the popular legislation. People aren't going to blame Biden. They're going to blame McConnell. It's an empty threat. It's a totally empty threat. It's another bluff by Mitch. This time, I think the Democrats have to call his bluff. I'm going to say something else about this as well. I'm going to say a few things about it. The first thing, I'm going to say about it is there's Sinema, and there's Manchin. Now, I don't think there's going to be Tester, because when push comes to shove, Tester can't run in Montana and save his Senate seat unless he runs as a Democrat. So if he expects to continue, why? Because he's not going to be able to run more right wing than a Republican in Montana or a Trumpist in Montana. And he has to be careful that a Trumpist in Montana doesn't out-left him. So he has nowhere to go. He has to stay in the Democratic Party. If Schumer imposes discipline on Tester and says, John, you vote with us to get rid of the filibuster or you lose your committee positions. No ifs, ands, or buts. Tester's going to fold because he can't go to the Republican Party. Now, Sinema may think she can go to the Republican Party. Manchin may think he can go to the Republican Party. But there are some barriers to that. The first barrier is, again, if there's a Trump third party, or even if there's a Trumpist nominee challenging for the nomination in the Republican Party, that Trumpist nominee is going to run to the left when it comes to economic issues compared to Sinema, and compared to Manchin. And if those two are no longer Democrats, they lose in 2024. They lose. They need to be Democrats in 2024. They're not going to shift over to the Republicans. What do they gain by shifting over to the Republicans? If they steal the Senate from the Democrats, then the Democrats are off the hook. They no longer have the majority in Congress. And they can run on a lefty platform in 2022 to beat the Trumpists and to beat Sinema. And Joe Manchin, well, they won't be running until 2024. But Democrats all over the country will be able to run to the left of Republicans and Trumpists all over the country to win those Senate races. And they'll take over the Senate again in 2023. And Sinema and Manchin will then be part of a dying party challenged by the Trumpists on the one hand, split between the Trumpists and the conventional Republicans. And Manchin and Sinema will be running as basically centrist Republicans, because that's really what they are. And they won't be able to win as centrist Republicans because the Republican Party will be split. But the Democratic Party won't be split. And Democrats who run against them in 2024 are going to beat them in 2024. But it's not even a question of beating them in 2024. If they leave the Democratic Party, they lose their committee positions. They lose those committee positions. They lose their seniority. They have to fold. If Schumer really applies the pressure to them, in the end, they have to fold. If the president applies the pressure to them, they have to fold. They can't stand up against that pressure. It is in the hands of Schumer, but he has to get tough. Okay, some other news today. Okay, so I decided, but today, that I would get into the act of trying to do something about the filibuster fight. And so I did a short thread, which has gotten some support. And I based the thread on my video of last night. And I'll briefly share that for you now. So there it is. Let me make sure. Type is probably too small. So let me do this. I'll take myself out of the picture for a moment and just be a disembodied voice, and you should be able to see it better. It's a thread of 4 tweets. Joe Manchin, Kirsten Sinema, John Tester, and other Democrats opposed to democracy in the Senate must be held accountable. If they don't, hashtag end the filibuster now, just as if they voted no on $2,000 checks, $15 per hour, since it's the same thing. Hashtag COVID relief, MFA, which of course is, I mentioned three things in the hashtag. COVID relief, MFA, which is Medicare for All, okay, and also GND, which is the Green New Deal. And I attached my video from last night and my argument concerning the filibuster. Then in the second tweet, I said, vote against the nuclear option. The hashtag end the filibuster now is to declare yourself an enemy of the people. And I tweeted that at Joe Manchin, at Kirsten Sinema, at John Tester, and at Lana Dell, okay, and Ramona Masacci, Pepper Oceana, time of posting. In other words, a whole group of people likely to repeat the tweet, each having a fair number of followers on Twitter. And then I also sent an at to AOC and to other Congress people to try to get them on board. And then my third tweet, that included Cori Bush, Jamal Bowman, and Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, Ayanna Pressley, Mondaire Jones, Ro Khanna, Marie for Congress, Jaya Powell. I also tweeted, okay, Marianne Williamson, okay, Bree Joy Gray, Ryan Knight, Crystal Ball, Sagar Angetti, and also Chuy Garcia and Raul Grijalva. And my fourth tweet, I said, remember, voting against hashtag nuclear option equals voting against ending COVID-19, 2K checks, MFA, GND, $15 per hour, eliminating student debt, affordable housing, and I put a hashtag on end the filibuster now. Okay, and then later, I related this thread to a much longer thread that was put out with the hashtag end the filibuster by Tom Perriello, who formerly ran for Congress here, okay, in this state, and who is now the director of the Open Society Group. And I probably had some retweets on that, okay, as well. So I'm waiting to see how that, okay, is going to develop. But I decided to take some action on this. And I urge you to start taking some action, at least on Twitter, okay, as well, to go to my Twitter feed and to pitch in and try to spread that and make those tweets actually trend. End the filibuster, hashtag end the filibuster, has a considerable number of tweets behind it now. But we really have to join with them and make that one trend. I think, okay, it's important. Okay, so the last thing that I want to cover tonight is a short paper It's called How Much Emergency Relief Will It Take to Revive the U.S. Economy? And it's by Adam Hirsch and Mark Paul. It was published by The Groundwork, by Collaborative. And I'm just going to go over some of the main points here. Okay, it makes the point that the federal government has two policy channels to support the economy. One is the monetary policy conducted by an independent Federal Reserve, and fiscal policy at the discretion of Congress. They also point out that Jay Powell, the chairperson at the Fed, has been clear that substantially more fiscal stimulus from Congress is needed. And of course, Janet Yellen, who is now the Treasury Secretary, is also calling for much more substantial fiscal relief. The authors say, and it's kind of a summary statement at the start, we estimate Congress needs to provide economic relief of between $3.5 trillion in the short term in order to get American families and businesses working at their full potential. That's an important statement. By the short term, I think they mean the next 6 months. That's what they're looking for from the federal government over the next 6 months in fiscal stimulus. Now, there's already been $900 billion in fiscal stimulus, but we don't know how effective that was from a fiscal multiplier standpoint. If we're generous and assume that it had sort of an average effectiveness, so it might fit somewhere between the $3 and $4.5 trillion range. In other words, it might fit somewhere as progress towards the $3 to $4.5 trillion range, but we don't have their estimate about that because they finished this paper on December 8th, before the $900 billion was actually spent. It's being spent now, of course, will be spent from now until March. They say here, additionally, Congress should enact automatic triggers to renew support in the event of a prolonged recovery. The reason for the automatic triggers is they don't want Congress to have to go through another vote once it's come to agreement on what kind of support is really necessary. In other words, to get it done, we will need the automatic triggers. They point out that their range of estimates accounts for a more realistic assessment of disguised unemployment, not captured in official measures, and reflects uncertainty around the extent to which a temporary shock will mutate into permanent economic scarring, as well as the size of the multiplier effect from increased federal outlays. They point out the growing consensus among economists is that more risk lies in going too small rather than in going too big. The longer Congress waits to act, the more permanent damage will be done. Of course, the Republicans are all about waiting to act and waiting to act and waiting to act. Why? I can only conclude it's because they want to do as much damage as possible so the Democrats get the blame so they can take over Congress again in 2022 and can have the presidency in 2024, and to hell with the American people. They always act that way. They always act that way. And they don't care so much about the permanent scarring anyway, because the permanent scarring happens to the poor people and to the middle class people and doesn't happen to their rich cronies. I think all this is true. It's obvious. It's what's going on all the time. Okay. So let's go to some of the major points they make in this paper. Okay, they point out that the pandemic change in employment sector, this graph talks to total employment, healthcare employment. Okay, the lowest reduction in employment, of course, was in healthcare employment. Okay, the greatest reduction was in passenger transportation. The next greatest was in leisure and hospitality. That, of course, crashed in the beginning and then came back somewhat, but is still off by 24.8%. Then there was retail trade, still off by 5.9%, which is substantial. And then the least amount was healthcare, whereas state and local must be somewhere here. I guess state and local is also off by 5.9%, roughly the same amount, as retail trade. So that's what this graphic shows. This was from an analysis of a Bureau of Labor Statistics data. Even with support from the CARES Act, they say an estimated 6 to 8 million Americans have fallen into poverty this year. Job losses have also taken a distinctly gendered tone. Job losses had larger shares of women workers, as women disproportionately withdrew from the labor force under pressures to provide unpaid but essential family care work at home. They make the point the pandemic shock presented a potential extinction level event for America's small and medium enterprises, also disproportionately represented in the most impacted industries identified in the graph. Early evidence suggests the pandemic is compounding the long-term trend towards slowing new business starts by accelerating small business exits or deaths by as much as 50% in some industries. The rocky implementation of the CARES Act Paycheck Protection Program and the Federal Reserve's Main Street lending program, which was hardly used, by the way, blunted their efficacy in supporting small and medium enterprises through the economic shock. Almost certainly, small business starts and job creations will suffer long-term setbacks, even post-pandemic, as lenders and investors are going to reassess their risks, raising the bar for potential entrepreneurs to access financing. So, now they go, but even with such unprecedented policy support as from the CARES Act, in November, the economy employed 10 million fewer people than in February. Already, the most recent data showed new job openings plateauing, while new hiring is slowing. Growing at November's pace of 245,000 new jobs, it will take 40 months to regain jobs lost since the start of the pandemic. That's nearly the whole Biden administration, and would still leave jobless new entrants, but to the labor force and those in disguised unemployment. With resurgent infections in every region of the country, $600 supplemental unemployment benefits expired, and other emergency economic measures such as pandemic unemployment assistance and pandemic emergency unemployment compensation set to expire in December, the rebound is bound to disappear without further action. Well, there was some further action, the $900 billion bill. Hopefully it will prop things up for the next for February and for March at least. But much of the support, of course, is going to end in March. With infections surging, the withdrawal of economic support is likely to put the economy even deeper into the hole. This, of course, is what's been happening. Okay. And there's another graph, change in state and local government employment. This is a comparison to the recession of 2008 to 2011. Actually, total employment during that recession was up by 0.8%. Okay, in the area, of education, it was up by 0.7%. In the area of education, it was up, by 0.8%. Contrast this to this lockdown period. It's minus 6.8% total, 9.6% in educational employment, down by 9.6%. And excluding education, it was down by 3.6%. That's state and local government employment. A lot of state and local government people lost their jobs. $1.3 million lost jobs for state, local, and tribal public employment from February to November. That's accounting for seasonal factors. So that's a disaster at that particular level. Now, going further, they make the point, Congress must set a target beyond returning to the old normal, because the pre-pandemic economy was already not working for too many Americans. The official unemployment rate, known as U3, reached an astounding 14.7% in April, before falling to 6.7% in November, roughly double its rate in January. However, headline unemployment figures paint a misleading picture of the health of the overall economy and help explain why in the year leading up to the pandemic, wages for regular workers grew at just 0.6%, despite official unemployment falling consistently below what economists used to consider, quote, full employment, an unemployment rate in the 5 to 6% range. The official unemployment rate excludes millions of people who've given up participating in the labor force. Now, they go on to make the point that for years, macroeconomic policymakers have been running the economy too cold, preventing millions of Americans from sharing the gains from growth in the economy. And they say this is true of the Federal Reserve, which controls monetary policy, as well as of Congress, which controls fiscal policy. Yes, not just for years, for decades, since the 1980s. The Fed is mandated to pursue dual objectives of stable prices and maximum employment. By the way, that's been true since 1979, folks. That's not new. So through this whole 40 years, when the Fed has been mandated to pursue maximum employment, economists and Fed governors have chronically underestimated how low unemployment can safely get, instead favoring to focus on stable prices at the expense of higher employment. And I have to add to this, in violation of the law for 41 years. Well, maybe not for 41 years, because in the last few years, Jay Powell seems to have taken the idea of getting to full employment fairly seriously for a Fed head. Well, let's say for 36 years, they were violating the law at the Fed. In fact, there is considerable room to run with monetary policy that can boost the economy without adverse consequences. While the Fed is intended to pursue its mandate independently from political influence, congressional fiscal policy has been explicitly constrained by politics in recent years. Before that, it's been constrained since Reagan, really. Political concerns famously led Obama's advisors to pull their punches in 2009 when considering the appropriate size of the fiscal response. And they go on, of course, to talk about that. So going through that, they make the following very important point. Many states never returned to where they were before the recession crises. Okay. For example, Michigan did not return to its pre-recession level of output until 2015. Arizona did not surpass its pre-recession level of output until 2016. Connecticut's economy never recovered. By the time the pandemic began, Connecticut's gross state product stood 4.2% below its 2007 level after adjusting for inflation. Relative to pre-Great Recession trends, an estimated 7 million potential workers have gone missing from the labor force in the face of poor job prospects resulting from the economy too cold. By the way, relative to the pre-Great Recession trends is a conservative way to look at it. If you want to take a more serious way to look at it, look at the trends coming out of the Clinton administration before the recession of 2000 and 2002. Take that as your baseline. And then see how many million potential workers have gone missing from the labor force in face of poor job prospects, because the peak of the labor participation rate was actually in those final years of the Clinton administration, not the final years of the Bush administration. So that was the effect of running the economy too cold. If participation in the labor force were the same as in 2007 before the Great Recession, the unemployment rate would be above 13% rather than 6.9% as measured by U3. And that's the headline unemployment rate. Remember, there's also a U6 unemployment rate as well, where people who are looking for full-time jobs but only have part-time jobs are included in that unemployment rate. That unemployment rate was probably about 5% greater than the 6.9%. That's off the top of my head. I'm not particularly sure about that. But if that's true, the U6 was at 11.9%, which means if you tack another 6.1% on that, which is more like the true unemployment rate, you are looking at 19.1% true unemployment right now. How big a hole do policymakers need to fill? Well, they use a law known as Okun's Law to provide a straightforward way to calculate the size of the hole, the size of the output gap, the gap between the economy's potential GDP when its labor and capital resources are fully used and where it stands now. So it turns out, but from that there's a huge gap to close. So they go through some of the economics, of this. They point out, taking this gap together with an estimate of current GDP in November of nearly 21.3 million implies that there was a potential GDP of more than 25.7 trillion, or an output gap of $4.5 trillion that fiscal policy needs to fill. I suspect this is not a wildly radical estimate, but really a pretty conservative estimate. I haven't actually done my own estimate, but I'd like to see what Bill Mitchell would come up with for the output gap in our economy. Who is Bill Mitchell? He is one of the MMT founders and co-author of the macroeconomics MMT textbook. For members of Congress, the question then becomes, what is the fiscal multiplier? Or in other words, how much economic activity does an additional dollar of net federal spending generate? The answer depends largely on how that dollar gets spent. In a sizable body of research since the Great Recession, economists have largely converged on the idea that fiscal multipliers are fairly large, in the range of 1.2 to 2. In other words, for every federal dollar spent, but the multiplier for how much the economy grows is between 1.2 and 2 during times of economic crisis. But as the economy approaches full capacity, the benefit of additional federal spending diminishes. Generally speaking, aid that flows to those most in need packs the biggest punch, as most of the aid flows back into the economy rather than being held in savings. CBO analyses find that each dollar of net spending given to corporations and high-income individuals generates just 40 cents and 60 cents, respectively, in additional economic activity. In other words, it's not only wasted, well, it's not completely wasted, but it generates only 40 cents or only 60 cents in additional activity. In contrast, $1 in direct transfer payments to individuals generates $2.10 in additional activity. So in other words, those survival checks that are being sent to people in direct transfer payments, except these aren't really transfer payments, or they'll only be transfer payments, if we try to make up for them in taxes, generates $2.10 in additional activity. So the multiplier for these checks that the Republicans and conservative Dems are so reluctant to hand out, that multiplier is $2.10, far higher than the 40 cents from the dollars they want to give to corporations and high-income individuals. The impact of direct transfers is higher where recipients are more financially stressed, with less discretionary disposable income. Similarly, stimulus dollars are more impactful in regional economies hit harder by economic downturns, like the rural areas of the United States, maybe. In recent projections, CBO employed a fiscal multiplier of 58 cents on the dollar, noting that current stimulus measures will be tempered by social distancing. Certainly, there is some truth to this observation, but only time will tell how accurate their assumed multiplier is. All we can say is it's way below what the research shows about these multipliers. Certainly, there's some truth to this observation. Only time will tell how accurate it is. But it is safe for policymakers to assume that economic impact payments received by well-off individuals are more likely destined for savings or for reductions in debt or spending on consumption of imported goods that may exacerbate the output gap. In contrast, recipients of expanded and supplemental unemployment insurance benefits and economic impact payments to households in financial precarity are likely to spend all of their support back into the economy to meet basic family needs like housing, food, and health care. New stimulus, well targeted to those most in need, could yield a substantially higher multiplier effect than assumed by CBO, but our interpretation of the evidence suggests even a broader stimulus aimed at supporting low and middle income households and the unemployed suggests that an average multiplier for a new net federal spending going forward would fall in the range of 1 to 1.5. That is conservative. I don't think they're considering the secondary and tertiary multipliers. Given the size of the current output gap, Congress should aim to provide COVID-19 relief package of $3 to $4.5 trillion. This is based on our assumptions regarding the multiplier. However, using the low multiplier favored by CBO, that suggests it would imply the need for a $7.7 trillion stimulus to fill our current economic hole. So in other words, the lower the multiplier is, the more the federal government would have to spend to fill the hole. Additional fiscal stimulus on this scale is essential to support the economy while individuals, businesses, and governments take life-saving measures to prevent transmitting infections that slow the economy and begin to repair the U.S. economy that for too long has left out so many Americans from economic gains. So now they conclude, okay, I don't think I have to conclude because I already have basically, that $3 to $4.5 trillion is likely to be too small because the first 900 billion of that was not so well targeted to individuals who need that money quickly and now, and whose positions were getting even worse and are getting worse by the day. So what that 900 billion is doing is it's not getting there fast enough. It's facilitating even a bigger hole coming about, perhaps. I don't know. But from this economic study, you see, things have to be done in a big way. They have to be done fast. They have to be done over the next 6 months, but immediately, while the people are in the state of emergency. Adam Hirsch is director of Washington Global Advisors, LLC, and a research associate at the Political Economy Research Institute, which is at the University of Massachusetts, at Amherst. And Mark Paul is an assistant professor of economics and environmental studies at the New College, of Florida. And Mark Paul is very, very good on a number of things, including the job guarantee, by the way. He's not, an MMTer. I think both of these individuals belong to the post-Keynesian school of economics that is practiced particularly at the Peary Institute at University of Massachusetts, in Amherst. So that's the school of economics, they belong to. Their estimates for something like this are usually going to be in the ballpark. They're worth actually listening to and taking seriously as to how much stimulus we are likely to need. If I had to say what MMTers would be likely to come up with, I would guess it would be even more spending by the federal government. Of course, the more that spending is deficit spending, the more likely it is to have the intended multiplier effects. And the more the spending is paid for by taxes, the less likely it will have the intended multiplier effects. So keep that in mind, folks. So here we are. I will return to the beginning here. Oh, Russ Goldman is here tonight. Hi, Russ. Okay, I covered Terry Cook's comment. And Dia Swift said, the Rachel Madcow, the Russia-gating idiot, and Matt says, did not the Pentagon come out to say that climate change was a national security threat? Yeah, the Pentagon's been saying that for years. Kay says, yes, they did. Of course, the Trump administration did not listen to them. From the standpoint of the Trump administration, they weren't a national security threat because there was no such thing as human-induced climate change. That was a fable in Trump's terms. Matt said, is there anyone that can stomach the Rachel Maddow show? Case has been following Michael Mann, climate scientist, for years. Yes, so have I. I think Mike is pretty good. He's from Penn State. Case says, not usually, but I did watch that one. Case says, wanted to see if Schumer grew a spine, laugh out loud. It's hard to tell what Schumer has to do is to squeeze the centrist Democrats and tell them if they don't get rid of the filibuster, they're going to lose their committee positions. Dia Swift says, I'm not impressed. Schmucky has been silent throughout all these presidencies. And now that the doomsday clock strikes again, his cowardly silence does not deserve admiration. Well, in the last few days, he hasn't been that silent. He hasn't been that silent. Now, he's been silent when it comes to Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema, but he shouldn't be making public statements about them. They should not have made public statements in contradiction to his statements. He needs to take them aside, and he needs to say, you both are going to have to shut your mouths and go along, or you're going to lose your committee positions. That's what's going to happen to you. Terry Cook says, so coal will no longer be used before we have the renewables are in place, bringing electric power plants to shut down, leaving huge numbers in the dark if you are not prepared, folks. I don't know about that, Terry. Evelina said, isn't that clean? They'll be mining big time for rare minerals that will be used to push new green energies. Hope not. And Russ says, evening, Dr. Joe. I think I'll hang out a bit. Glad to see you, Russ. Always glad to see you. Dia says, Biden is still sowing incremental crumbs. Yes. Kay says, how do we get all these executive orders into laws, though, so they can't be shot down by another GOP president? How? Get rid of the filibuster. Get rid of the filibuster. Terry says, are we going to plant 50 million acres to begin taking carbon out of the air? We got to do more than 50 million acres. I mean, we got to do the Teraton Initiative and put it in the ground like no other plant on Earth. Also bring in 50 million jobs. that will never leave, also not in the Green New Deal, the Top Cat plan. And Dolores Pierce says, I'm really annoyed with the foot dragging on 2K checks. Me too. I'm very annoyed. Not only that, we still don't have Barney's stimulus check. I mean, I just got mine 2 days ago. We've been waiting for Barney. Actually, today was the third day. Barney's check still hasn't come. I'm sure we'll find the check was dated January 6th. It's January 27th. The post office still not working. They got to dismiss the whole post office management team. They're still hurting us. Terry said 6% of our farmland is all it takes planting hemp to fulfill all our energy needs. The emperor wears no clothes. Jack Herrick. Okay, and Dia Swift said, no, it ain't, Ilhan. Kay says, Bernie's trying to handle that, Russell. Evelina puts thumbs down. Terry Cook says, $22.50 should be the minimum wage. Yes, at least $22.50 in the lowest cost area. Well, I don't know if that's true for the lowest cost area, okay, in the United States. That may be the average minimum wage. I'd have to look at the MIT cost of living calculators. Check that out and see what it says. Dia says, even Mosler mentioned Biden is holding back too much and referred to the fifth deadly innocent fraud, but to elaborate on his point. What is the fifth deadly innocent fraud again? I have to look that up. Fossil fuel is the driving force of our corporate enslavement. I think I have about 65 different fiscal myths myself, but his 7 deadly innocent frauds are certainly among them. Terry Cook says hemp grown in massive amounts is our answers for no arsenic, no mercury, no lead from fossil coal. Hemp charcoal is coming next year. Who's it coming from, Terry? Yes, a country that, if you wish to have the worst chance of surviving your infant and childhood, this United States is number 1 in mortality, and Japan is number 1 in immortality. Why? It is against the nation of Japan laws for a child under 2 years old gets no vaccine. Oh, no vaccines are given to children under 2 years old? Wow. That's interesting. Dia Swift says, Democrat like the Funky 8 are their own enemy and ours. Terry says, wishing for good and having no plan to combat evil has us in our deepest downward spiral. 7% hemp seed diesel fuel, 93% green hydrogen are coming for all commercial trucking, the Top Cat plan. Dia says, the Democrats are reactionary, no spine. And Terry says, right now we have 8,000 Americans making more than $125 million a year. Within 5 years into the hydrogen economy, we'll see those 8,000 making 125 million yearly transform into 2 million yearly, 200,000 people making at least 250,000 a year. Because of several reasons, the average wage earner will no longer be spending 80% of their paycheck for energy of some kind. We'll have at least 200 million DGAs, Distributed Generation Association members, making their own, I presume that's their own fuel or their own energy. And Dia says, laugh out loud, the loon Marjorie Greene's nickname is cucumber or cumersome. Cumersome, what does that mean? Oh, or cucumbersome. Typo. Cucumbersome. Kay says, hemp is so good for so many things, including climate change. Dia says, Adam Kinzinger, Republican of Illinois, wants Donald impeached. Could he be an asset in making that possible? If he comes in and he testifies in the Senate, if he's one of the witnesses, maybe he could be important. But he's in the House, so he's not in the Senate. Ivanka is challenging Marco Stupido for his seat. There's your Trumpist. We'll see. And Dia says, hey guys, have you heard? Batterio of the Proud Boys is an informant. Who's he an informant for? The FBI? Dia Swift said, Schumer wants to court Republicans. He's never going to get tough with them. And Dia Swift says, great job, Tweety Bird. Kay says, you go, Joe. Dolores Pierce says, hashtag end the filibuster. Dia Swift says, hashtag end the filibuster. That hashtag is being used by Perriello. That's a good hashtag. I think a better hashtag would have been end the filibuster now. I've been using that hashtag, end the filibuster now. But since so many are already tweeting with the end the filibuster, we might have to join that. It's not so very different. Cannabis, in addition to blocking receptors used by COVID, additionally increases protective peptides. That's great. So cannabis wards off COVID, huh? I didn't realize that. That's nice. Dia says nothing is going to revive the economy until this nation goes into serious quarantine. Well, I think Biden is going to facilitate shutdowns, of the economy in local areas that are not containing the virus. Kay says, if I could go back to growing my own pot, I could get off of my beer to sleep at night. Steve says, prices for Donald Trump's New York City properties are an absolute free fall. Yeah, probably because he can't come back to New York City because he'll face prosecution. Lana Dell hates the clock says, I watched the FOMC presentation today. That's the Federal Open Market Committee, the Federal Reserve. Pretty good. I was a little surprised. Powell said there isn't as much bank loan defaults as they expected. Yes, because the banks are playing extended pretend. Extended pretend, right? Kay says, hope he goes broke. Lana says, he also said he expected the boost to housing prices to be temporary. I hope so. The prices around Minneapolis have risen since I was looking in the summer quite a bit. Kay says, capitalism has ruined everything good about this country. Xmas is now all about the money, and most other holidays are too. I'm learning to hate this country. Elaine McForbes says, hi, Elaine. Steve Wolfbrand says, hello. Kay says, governing should not be this corrupt or difficult. And Kay says, hi, Steve. And Steve says, hi, Kay. And Steve Wolfbrand says, hello. And Steve says, hi, Kay. I was watching another group I'm in. And Lana says, love Bill Mitchell. And Kirsten Beatrice Pirelli says, great show, Joe. Love you. Take care. Thank you, Kirsten. And Lana Dell Hates the Clock says, we know Mark Paul. And Lana Dell Hates the Clock says, no, I can't listen to Rachel M anymore. She gets me pretty mad too. I can't I can't listen or watch. I mean, every time I happen to encounter her on on YouTube. Okay, I watch for about 30 seconds. That's about as long as it takes me to gag slightly, and then I leave. Kay says, my internet keeps going out again. Shake my head. Sorry to hear it, Kay. Terry Cook says the United States is number one in deaths of our babies dying in the first 24 hours of life. And why is that? They make lots more having a dead infant than a live one. Blood or organs and lung tissue. Oh, God, Terry, that's awful.
That's true.
Dia Swift says insomnia is most often because the liver doesn't get enough protein calories. Beer may prevent absorption of protein. Terry Cook says 110 cannabinoids come into your body by way of hemp, CBD oil, hemp hearts, seeds without the shells, and eatables, and Mary Jane joints. Thank you for that information, Terry. Thank you all for coming. It is now 10:59, and I'm going to say good night since I've caught up to your comments. And thank you for the conversation. I will be tomorrow at 9 o'clock. Terry Cook says cannabis enhances all body functions, organs, keeps lungs. And Dolores Pierce says thank you and good night all. Thank you, Dolores. Thank you for sharing. Thank everybody who did for sharing. And good night all.